Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. We're almost reached the end of the year. And as we look back this year, there are a couple of new global trends that have emerged, which we shall look at in the next episode. But in this episode, we will like to talk about the recent comments from Russian foreign minister and also the comments that have come in with respect to the Ladakh standoff between India and China, the relationship between China and Russia, as well as the worsening relationship between China and Australia. So, all of that. But I would like to begin with what Lavrov has said, Harsh, and what he said now in respect of the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific has been reiterating his earlier stand. We remember that he made a similar comment or the same comment when he was here for the Raisina dialogue in January 2020. And he said that the usage of the word Indo-Pacific in place of Asia-Pacific is a narrow way of looking at things. And he's also said that it is less democratic, and he's objected to it earlier too. Now that he's again saying it, that it is basically West's idea of containing China, to which India should not fall prey to. India has reiterated and said that India's foreign policy is independent, and we know what we are doing, rightly so. But how do you see this in context of the China Russia relationship and also in the context of India Russia relationship? Is Russia clubbing India in that Western bloc now?
Yes, I think, Naghma, in some ways, much has changed during 2020. I think the world is quite unrecognizable if you're watching it in December 2020 compared to what happened in January 2020. But if there is one thing perhaps that has remained unchanged, is Russia's opposition to the Indo-Pacific. I think that is, we started the year with that comment by Mr. Lavrov at the Raisina dialogue, and we are ending it almost by Russia once again reiterating its opposition to the construct of the Indo-Pacific. And it's quite interesting because this has been a year when Indo-Pacific actually got so much traction that it's virtually, there is no debate about it in the region itself. People, countries, nations have acknowledged it, accepted it. Countries are adopting it in their national strategies. Even those countries that were at one point skeptical about the idea have adopted it pretty open-mindedly. ASEAN has come out with its Indo-Pacific vision. And the idea of Indo-Pacific has traveled all the way to Western Europe. So it's not simply in Asia that we are witnessing the acceptance of the logic of Indo-Pacific, but we are now looking at countries like France and Germany and Netherlands, all of them adopting it in their own national security, in their national worldviews of how they look at the changing world, and and Indo-Pacific being the center of gravity of global politics, global economics, challenges and opportunities that are emerging in the world. So it's quite extraordinary, I think, to hear from Mr. Lavrov his incessant opposition about what perhaps in Indo-Pacific signifies. But what I think it perhaps a bit disturbingly portends is that India-Russia relations need to have an honest conversation, I think. We need to have an honest conversation about where this relationship is going. This has come very close to a very recent statement of Mr. Putin, where he actually said there is a possibility of a military alliance between Russia and China, although he said it's not in the cards, we don't need it, there is so much trust that we actually don't need it, but he said it can't be ruled out. So it's very interesting that when it comes to their own national interest, when it comes to Russia's own priorities, it's a question of how they look at the world through the prism of the West. When it comes to India, there is not even a recognition of the challenge that China is posing. And I think that is, to me, is very, very significant, because clearly this year, if you have learned anything about Indian foreign policy this year, it is that Sino-Indian fault lines have only expanded, and there is no resolution of those challenges. So for a partner like Russia, which we call our strategic partner, our historical partner, our time-tested partner, not to understand that fundamental vulnerability, it seems to me that perhaps will have grave implications for the relationship. And for Mr. Lavrov to suggest that somehow India is a pawn in this game where India is, is being moved by other countries according to their priorities is also a fundamental misunderstanding. After all, the very reason that India sits at the table with Russians and the Chinese and often talks about the challenges that emerge from the West should have alerted him to the fact that India is quite open-minded about its arrangements, its coalitions, its priorities, its interests, to somehow then make India a country that cannot make up its mind, that is being driven by other agencies, that does not have an agency of its own. I
Yes.
think that all should be worrying both in New Delhi, and that should be worrying, and that should also, I think, there should be a broader debate even amongst Russian policymakers, that if this is the trend that continues, then they may lose India, because
Mhm.
Indians are worried about China. Indians are responding in a manner that
So
befits
that's
their
very
international
significant and
interests. That's the
disturbing too.
challenge.
That's very significant and disturbing that they may lose India also because their perception towards India is completely changing. And they are totally dismissive of the threat that China poses in front of India. We know that there has been a 7-month long standoff, Harsh, in the eastern Ladakh sector. And S. Shankar, while speaking at the FICCI forum, has said that it is very detrimental to China as well. He said that we will tackle this, we'll deal with it, but it's been very detrimental to China because the public perception about China has changed significantly, not only here in India, but of course the entire world. But he also did not risk a speculation of a breakthrough. Which means that this is going to be the new normal, probably. Is that what it is signifying?
Yes, I think India is perhaps prepared for that long haul. We keep hearing about the structures that have been built by the Chinese for long-term positioning along the border, the kind of kits, the kind of the defense equipment that they are positioning. Uh, you know, the thermal wear, for example, that is coming and they are developing for these high altitude war fighting. So clearly, Chinese are thinking that they will be positioned there, that there is that there is no breakthrough, at least in the short to medium term. And Indians are positioning themselves along similar lines. They also recognize the challenge that China poses. So therefore, I think for India, it should be quite a bit of a concern
Mhm.
that a friend like Russia does not see this trend emerging and does not even acknowledge it. We don't want Russia to take our side, but at least an acknowledgement that there is a challenge that India faces, and therefore India needs partners. Much as India appreciates the fact that Russia has a problem with the Western nations, and India has often been a votary of Russian positions. India has argued that the kind of malevolence at times that is shown to Russia has put Russia in an open embrace with the Chinese. But if you don't have any reciprocity of that acknowledgement, then I think it portends very badly for the relationship. And I'm afraid, if you look at India's foreign policy priority as the foreign minister also Indian foreign minister also articulated, about China, about how Indian priorities are changing, and how India-China relationship can never go back to normal unless you resolve the border dispute. This has to be accepted by India's friends and should be supported in some ways, because India is not the one that has changed the border contours unilaterally.
But
That
does
has
that also mean that Russia basically wants or is looking at the entire thing in that bipolar vision of the US bloc and the Russian bloc, and is dismissive of the fact that the world has changed? India's relationship with different countries are different now. We want to maintain a relationship with the United States. We also want to maintain the relationship with Russia. So Russia is kind of negating this new approach or the changes in India's outlook, and probably wants India to be in the Russian bloc, which has been the legacy of the Cold War.
Yes, and it's a bit of a very uh, dated mindset that you
Mhm.
do not see the challenges that are emerging constantly. And it's not that Russia does not face challenge from China in some sectors, but I think the idea that somehow their foreign policy priority of challenging the West has to take precedence over everything else, and therefore,
Mhm.
because they need to have they need to have a substantive engagement with the Chinese, means that all other countries, especially a country like India, should be subservient to that larger foreign policy goal, is something that is beyond comprehension. because clearly it's not simply about India. If the Russians become the only country today, the only major power that is constantly harping on this idea of Indo-Pacific being a Western ploy, Indo-Pacific being a something unnatural, then Russia also alienates itself from the larger Indo-Pacific geography. Russia has important stakes in that geography. Russia needs to be a very important player in that geography. But every other country in that geography today acknowledges that Indo-Pacific is today a reality. It's not simply a theoretical debate. It's a strategic imperative for most of these countries to look at the Indian and Pacific Oceans as one common maritime space. And therefore, you have to position yourself, your foreign policy and national security priorities accordingly. Now, for Russia not to understand this means that Russia gets alienated not simply from India, but also from other countries. ASEAN, you have Japan, you have Australia, and now the Western Europe is coming into Indo-Pacific in a major way. So if Russia does not play its cards right, then certainly they can have their own national interest in building strong ties with China, which is understandable, which is doable, which they are trying to build. If they are talking of a possible military alliance and something that's very wonderful. But if India decides to develop relations with Western nations, if India decides to develop with America, with Japan, with Australia, that also should be understandable.
So
That should
this
be.
is like a hangover that the Russians have still. How do you look at this? And what does it say about their foreign policy? He's also been critical of the Quad. He's also saying that this is diminishing the centrality of ASEAN.
What is interesting, Naghma, they are protesting more than the Chinese today.
Yes.
Chinese are not so vocal today. If you look at official Chinese responses, at one point they said, "Oh, this will disappear like foam in the sea." Right? They used to talk about Quad and the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. Yeah.
But today they have become much more cautious in their response, official response. The tabloid media, the media, state-driven media does all kinds of things, says all kinds of things. But official Chinese response is much more moderate because they are acknowledging the reality that the countries they are surrounded by are actually have brought in Indo-Pacific as a construct. So in some ways, this year at the level of ideas has been a big defeat for the Chinese because they were trying so hard to discredit Indo-Pacific. It has not worked. It did not work. And this year you saw acceptance of the logic of Indo-Pacific across the board. So they have, and they are very pragmatic in that sense. They seem to have, they seem to be gradually becoming more comfortable with this idea that this is here to stay. But it's the Russians that on all public platforms are the most vociferous opponents of this idea, which is quite intriguing because if you want to do Chinese bidding, you have a right to do that. But also then don't expect India to constantly to constantly be made to look like a second tier country. India is not, and India will play the game of global politics much like much in tune with Indian priorities. India is not being driven by the West. India is being driven by its own interests. In 2007, India rejected Quad. Into 2017, India came back to Quad because India decided when it wants to join it. India decided what the terms of that engagement would be. So I think for Russians not to understand this being our time-tested friends, as they like to call it, and we like to call them, then I think that's a bit of a disappointment.
Yeah, there was an interesting tweet about that from Ramachalani, saying that Lavrov is bearing his panda hugging traits. So, but clearly Russia is in denial of the Chinese aggression too. While the rest of the world is very wary of the Chinese aggression in many areas, and not just here in its neighborhood, but elsewhere too. Russia is in denial, looks like it's in denial. We've also seen the latest case of, the Hong Kong media tycoon and the a critic of Beijing being charged under China's national security law. And in the context of the relationship between US and China, the deteriorating relationship, this is going to become a bigger international news. We've seen objection from UK. We've also heard that Mike Pompeo slammed this. Earlier, this person has been asking for sanctions, draconian sanctions from the US, which actually did not take place. But how do you see that now that he's being charged under the national security law? What kind of outcry or protests will we see from across the globe?
Well, I think, in some ways, what the Chinese have done with their national security law, they have done exactly what the critics said they would do. And you remember the discussion everyone was
Yeah.
having around the time, and everyone said that this is what is going to happen. They are going to use it for crushing domestic dissent, and that's exactly what they have done. If you have people like the Jimmy Lai, you have people like in fact Bloomberg staffer, one of the
Yes.
Bloomberg staffers have been has been put behind bars. You have a situation where the pro-democracy dissident groups have been charged with all kinds of laws within the broader rubric of the national security law. So clearly, Chinese, the intent is, I mean, it's very evident what the Chinese needed this law for. And they have used it with a certain ruthlessness that is associated with the Chinese Communist Party. And so, and the issue here is that the options in some ways for the rest of the world are very, very limited. We have seen UK, for example, commenting on this and expressing its dissatisfaction. But in real terms, in operational terms, what can UK or any other country do is a question that hangs over, I think, this entire debate. I think everyone seems to be now waiting for the Biden administration to come in and hoping that they would be tougher on issues like human rights and China's domestic spaces. I don't know. I'm not so sure at the moment, given that we are getting mixed signals from Biden administration. A lot of the people there want a larger cooperative framework to emerge with the Chinese. So whether they would be working towards a larger rapprochement with the Chinese, which would allow certain kinds of issues to be resolved. But largely, I think for the rest of the world, it's a bit of a mess because we really, their ability to shape Chinese domestic politics is severely limited, and we can criticize the idea that we may argue that Chinese have actually done very poorly for themselves and their PR. But for the Chinese Communist Party, that's not a priority. For them, the priority is to remain in office. If that's the priority, then they are doing relatively well. They have crushed dissent in Hong Kong. The pro-democracy groups are disappearing by the day. They are dissolving. They're dissolving themselves. There is also a larger sense that they have been left to fend for themselves, because no other country is actually speaking up on this matter, and it's very difficult. Again, the options are relatively limited. China already faces a lot of whatever the so-called liberal world could do, they have done it. They have ostracized China in certain platforms. They have talked about this inquiry into COVID-19. They have put I think the Trump administration's approach was much stronger. But again, and they have even till last week they have been sanctioning Chinese companies. But now that you have the power transition happening in Washington, I think this is the period that becomes one of the most difficult ones, because you do not really have any leadership from the US till January. So we will wait and watch and see what Mr. Biden does. But I don't think that on the issue of Hong Kong, there is much that can be done, as China has systematically now dismantled the one country, two systems model, the 1997 model that was at the very heart of the UK-China bargain on Hong Kong. But that bargain is gone, and UK and other, the Western world actually gave up too much leverage very early on. So now the leverage is very limited, and I don't have great hopes that the world has the ability to intervene in these matters.
So they are mere spectators in this case. That means, I mean, they have objected, they have slammed the move. Jimmy Lai has been charged with collusion with a foreign country, and he's the highest profile person to be charged under this law. But like you said, other than those comments, there has been nothing more concrete, and probably it's not in their power to do much more.
It looks like, and I think, the issue was that if the ability of the West, of the world at large, had to be demonstrated. It had to be demonstrated early on, when the law was being negotiated, when the law was being discussed. Now the law has passed. They have ruthlessly over the last few months gone about. Chinese
Misusing
Communist
it.
Party has gone about doing its work. There is, and everything that was said at that time, Chinese have done exactly that. So in a sense, we can almost say, we can pat our back saying that, look, Chinese are doing what we said. But the resolution of the problem, the how do you challenge China on these matters, that remains again, very, very debatable. And I don't see this, ending particularly well for either the pro-democracy groups or the issue of Hong Kong or this model of one country, two systems that was at the heart of this engagement. And I think for the rest of the world, we will wait, and we will continue to wait, and we will continue to watch what perhaps emerges in a few months' time, when you have a Washington setting out, when a Biden administration sets out its own agenda vis-a-vis China. But I think the ability of the Western world on this matter in particular is very, very limited. And as we also know how what they are, how the Chinese are responding to those countries who are standing up. I mean, India is one case in point, Australia is the other case in point.
Yes, absolutely. Boris Johnson has also objected to this, and we heard his comment. But other than that, there is not much that is. I mean, that nothing has really stopped China from carrying out whatever it intends to do. Now, I would just like to, since we are short on time, if we come back to the India-UK relationship. And we know that the Prime Minister, in his telephonic conversation on the 27th of November, had extended the invitation to the UK Prime Minister to be the chief guest here at the Republic Day parade. And they've also talked about increasing the relationship between India and UK on all fronts, be it strategic and defense and trade. And we also know, we've all seen the blooper from Boris Johnson on the farmer issue, after which the UK clarified and said that we're following the farmer protests very closely. But how significant would this be? This invitation from India, and if Boris Johnson is coming here as the chief guest for the Republic Day, if we put that in context of the India-UK relationship, and how is it going forward?
I think India played its cards well in this case, because Boris Johnson would really love to have this kind of an outreach with the rest of the world at a time when I think the EU deal, the Brexit deal, perhaps is not going to happen. Whatever indications we have till now, that it's going to be very, very difficult for the European Union and Britain to come to some kind of a negotiated settlement, because I think it's this week, in fact, today is the last day, and then the negotiations are not moving forward. So I think for Mr. Johnson, one of his main policies has been to establish Britain at what he calls global Britain. That Britain is not simply an appendage to European Union, but it has much larger footprint. And I think coming to India on the Republic Day as a chief guest would certainly bolster that sentiment that Britain is still has weight around the world, despite coming out of the EU, and it can stand on its own when it comes to negotiating engagements with major powers, major countries like India. And so I think the move is it's quite in the right direction, and I hope that when Mr. Johnson comes next month, both sides are prepared, because there is what we have seen in the last few years, because of various reasons. Initially, India was reluctant, and then when Mr. Modi made his visit to UK, which was much delayed over the last few years. No Indian Prime Minister had gone before Mr. Modi for ages, and when he went, there was a sense that perhaps things can move in the right direction, but then Britain got consumed with its Brexit and Brexit, debates, and what's the right approach to these negotiations with Europe, etc. And we lost a lot of time. So I think for Britain, it is important now to have relationships with countries like India. Britain is also challenging China on a number of fronts. For example, 5G. It was Mr. Johnson's idea that democracy should come together and develop 5G technology together, and work together. So for India, Britain's role in the Indo-Pacific is going to be very, very crucial, given that both India and Britain share like-minded values when it comes to maritime space. And I think given our historical links, given the links with diaspora, given our cultural ties, Britain in a way is a natural partner. It used to be our entry point into the European Union initially. Now that it is out of European Union, India will have to build renewed engagement with Britain in the new set of circumstances. So I hope that trade negotiations, security negotiations, and the larger Indo-UK relationship becomes a bit more ambitious than it has been in the recent past. because there is so much potential there that has not been harnessed. And when Mr. Johnson comes, I think that would be on the agenda, clearly to raise the level of our engagement to one where strategic partnership between these two historical partners actually fructifies. So I hope that happens. But Mr. Johnson clearly has a lot on his plate at the moment, and whether he would be able to devote time
Mhm.
post these negotiations, post what happens on Brexit, to solidifying and presenting a very strong agenda on India-UK relations remains to be seen. But I think that the trend lines are that if Mr. Johnson wants Britain post-Brexit to emerge as a leading player on the global scene, then he has to build relationships with countries like India, in a completely changed context. And I hope that's what the agenda is
All right.
for
So, and he seems to
January
be,
2020.
yeah, seems to be willing. Both the prime ministers have agreed to work towards a quantum leap in trade, commerce, defense, and on many fronts and health sector. So we're looking forward to that, and that will be pretty significant if the UK prime minister comes here on the visit to be the chief guest in the Republic Day parade. But that's all that we have time for in this episode. So we'll see you next week. Thank you for watching. Thanks a lot, Harsh.